The green room at NBC Studios was small and cramped. Two couches facing each other, a coffee table with stale pastries, bad lighting. It was 1967, and Dean Martin and Bob Hope were both scheduled to appear on a variety special celebrating American comedy. They'd arrived around the same time and ended up waiting together before their segments. Dean was sitting on one couch, relaxed, a coffee cup in his hand. Bob Hope was on the other, flipping through notes for his routine. A production assistant had just left. The door closed, and for the first time that day, the two men were alone. Bob looked up from his notes. "You ready for this, Dean?" Dean smiled. "As ready as I ever am." "Must be nice," Bob said. There was something in his tone, not quite friendly. Dean's smile didn't waver. "What's that supposed to mean?" Bob set down his notes. "Just that you make it look easy, the whole Dean Martin thing. Roll out of bed, have a drink, tell a few jokes, presto, career." Dean studied Bob's face. "You think that's how it works?" "Isn't it?" Bob leaned back. "Come on, Dean, we all know your act. The lovable drunk. The guy who shows up half in the bag and wings it. It's a good gimmick. Simple, effective." "Gimmick," Dean repeated quietly. "Sure, that's what it is, right? You play the drunk, people laugh, you make it look like you're not even trying. Meanwhile, some of us are actually working, actually crafting material, actually—" He trailed off, shaking his head. Dean set down his coffee cup. "What are you really saying, Bob?" Bob Hope looked at him for a long moment. Then he said it, clear, direct, the words he'd apparently been holding back. "You're just a drunk with a microphone, Dean. That's all you are." The green room went completely silent. Outside in the hallway, voices and footsteps could be heard. Someone laughed at something, but inside that small room there was nothing. Just the weight of what Bob Hope had just said. Dean didn't respond right away. He just looked at Bob. 5 seconds. 10. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable. Bob shifted in his seat but didn't back down, didn't take it back. Finally, Dean spoke. His voice was calm, quiet, almost gentle. "Bob, you work so hard to be funny. I just am. That's the difference." Bob's face went red. His mouth opened like he was going to respond, but nothing came out. He just stared at Dean, frozen. Dean stood up slowly. "I'm going to go find the makeup room. See you on stage." And he walked out, leaving Bob Hope there in stunned silence. For the rest of the taping, Bob Hope and Dean Martin barely looked at each other. They did their segments separately. When they were on stage at the same time for the finale, they stood on opposite ends. Bob cracked jokes, Dean sang a song. The audience loved it all. They had no idea that anything was wrong. But backstage, everyone knew. The production assistant who'd been near the green room had heard raised voices. Word spread. By the end of the night, half the crew knew that Bob Hope and Dean Martin had some kind of confrontation. The details got fuzzy in the retelling, but everyone agreed on one thing. Whatever Bob had said to Dean, Dean's response had left Bob speechless. In the weeks that followed, Bob Hope didn't talk about the incident, not publicly, but people close to him noticed he was touchy whenever Dean Martin's name came up. And when the Dean Martin show continued to dominate the ratings, outperforming Bob's own specials, Bob's mood darkened. "He doesn't even try," Bob complained to a friend. "He just shows up, does his drunk act, and everyone eats it up. Where's the craft? Where's the work?" Maybe that's the point. Maybe Dean's genius is making it look effortless. "It's not effortless," Bob snapped. "It's lazy." But that wasn't true, and deep down, Bob knew it. Dean Martin had been in the business for decades, had worked nightclubs, had paid his dues, had honed his craft to the point where it appeared effortless. That wasn't laziness, that was mastery. But Bob couldn't see it, or wouldn't see it, because acknowledging Dean's talent meant acknowledging that Bob's own approach, the meticulous preparation, the carefully timed jokes, the workmanlike execution, wasn't the only way, and maybe wasn't even the best way. Years passed. Bob Hope and Dean Martin saw each other occasionally at industry events. They were cordial, professional. but there was a distance that hadn't been there before. Dean never told the story publicly. When asked about Bob Hope, he'd say, "Bob's a legend, one of the greats. Nothing more, nothing less." But Bob couldn't let it go. The words Dean had said in that green room haunted him. "You work so hard to be funny. I just am." Was that true? Did Bob work too hard? Did his comedy feel labored compared to Dean's natural ease? Bob started paying attention to Dean's shows, really watching them. And what he saw disturbed him because Dean made it look so easy. The timing, the delivery, the way he connected with an audience, it all seemed to flow naturally. While Bob felt like he was pushing, Dean was just being. In 1975, Bob Hope was at a party in Beverly Hills. Dean Martin was there too, across the room. Bob watched him for a while. Dean was telling a story to a small group. They were laughing, not because the story was particularly funny, but because Dean's delivery, his presence, made everything entertaining. Bob felt something he hadn't expected. Not anger, not resentment, but something closer to sadness, or maybe regret. Later that night, Bob found himself near Dean at the bar. "Dean," Bob said. Dean turned. "Bob, how are you? Can we talk just for a minute?" Dean nodded. They moved to a quieter corner of the room. Bob was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Then he said, "That thing I said to you in the green room at NBC years ago, about you being just a drunk with a microphone." Dean's expression didn't change. "I remember." "I was wrong," Bob said. The words seemed to cost him something. "I was angry, jealous maybe. You made it look so easy, and I worked so hard at it, and I resented you for that. But I was wrong." Dean was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You think I don't work at this?" "That's not what I mean, Bob. I've worked at this my whole life. The difference is, I learned to hide the work, to make it look natural. That's my job, to make people forget they're watching a performance, but it's still a performance. It's still work." Bob nodded slowly. "I didn't see it that way. You thought I was taking the easy way." Dean finished. "I know. A lot of people think that. And maybe I've done too good a job making it look effortless. But Bob, there's no easy way in this business. We all work. We just show it differently. I said something cruel, something I didn't mean. Or maybe I did mean it at the time, but I was wrong to say it. I'm sorry." Dean looked at him for a long moment. Then he extended his hand. Apology accepted. They shook hands, and something that had been broken years ago started, very slowly, to heal. The story of what happened in that NBC green room in 1967 eventually made its way through Hollywood. Different versions existed. Some said Bob Hope had been drunk when he insulted Dean. Others claimed Dean had provoked Bob first. A few insisted the whole thing was blown out of proportion. But the people who knew both men understood what had really happened. Bob Hope, who'd built his career on precision and hard work, had looked at Dean Martin's apparent effortlessness and seen it as a shortcut, as something less than, and he'd lashed out. And Dean, who'd spent decades perfecting the art of making everything look easy, had responded with a truth that cut deeper than any insult could. That working hard at being funny and simply being funny weren't the same thing. Years later, after Dean Martin had died, Bob Hope was asked about their relationship in an interview. "Dean was a genius," Bob said. "I didn't always see it. I was so caught up in my own way of doing things that I couldn't appreciate his. But he was a genius." "You two had a falling out once, didn't you?" the interviewer asked. Bob nodded. "We did. I said something I shouldn't have. Something cruel. And Dean, he didn't get angry. He didn't yell. He just said something that made me realize how wrong I was." "What did he say?" Bob smiled slightly. "He told me I worked too hard to be funny, that he just was. And he was right. I was so busy trying to be perfect that I forgot to be human." Dean never forgot that. That's why people loved him, not because he played a drunk, but because he was real. Or at least he made you believe he was real. And that's harder to do than any joke I ever told. Did you stay friends? Eventually, Bob said. It took time. I had to swallow my pride, had to admit I was wrong. But we got there, and I'm glad we did, because Dean taught me something important. What was that? That there's more than one way to connect with an audience. My way was to dazzle them with wordplay and timing. Dean's way was to make them feel like they were hanging out with a friend. Both are valid. Both are hard. But I spent too many years thinking my way was the only way, and that almost cost me a friendship with one of the best men I ever knew. Bob paused, looking at something beyond the camera. You know what the worst part was? Dean never held it against me. Not really. When I finally apologized years later, he just shook my hand and said we were good. No lecture, no "I told you so," just acceptance. That's how he was. And it made me feel even worse about what I'd said, because I realized that while I'd been busy judging him, he'd never once judged me. He just let me be Bob Hope, with all my insecurities and my need to prove myself, and I couldn't extend him the same courtesy. The interviewer asked one more question. If you could go back to that green room in 1967, what would you say to Dean instead? Bob smiled sadly. I'd say, teach me how you do it, because that's what I really wanted to know. Not how to pretend to be drunk or how to make it look easy, but how to be comfortable enough in your own skin that you didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Dean had that. I spent my whole life chasing it, and I finally figured out you can't chase it. You either have it or you don't. Dean had it. I didn't. And calling him a drunk with a microphone was just my way of trying to convince myself that what I had was better. It wasn't. It was just different, and it took me way too long to understand that. The incident in the NBC Green Room became one of those stories that defined both men in unexpected ways. For Bob Hope, it became a moment of reckoning, a realization that his approach to comedy, while valid, wasn't superior to anyone else's. That Dean Martin's apparent ease wasn't laziness, but artistry. For Dean Martin, it was validation, proof that what he did, the effortless cool, the natural charm, the ability to make everything seem easy, was real, was valuable, was something that even Bob Hope, with all his success and accolades, couldn't quite achieve. And for both of them, it became a reminder that words have weight, that insults, once spoken, can't be unspoken, that jealousy and resentment can poison even the best relationships, but also that apologies, sincere ones, can heal wounds if given enough time. Bob Hope regretted what he said in that green room for the rest of his life, not because it ruined his career or destroyed his reputation, but because it hurt someone he respected, someone he, in his own complicated way, admired. And Dean Martin, for his part, forgave him, not right away, but eventually, because Dean understood something Bob took years to learn, that everyone in this business is struggling in their own way, trying to connect, trying to be loved, trying to make people laugh or cry or feel something. The methods are different, the styles vary, but the struggle is universal. Bob Hope worked hard to be funny. Dean Martin made it look easy. Both were valid. Both were valuable. Both were the result of decades of dedication to craft. The difference was that Dean had learned to hide the work, and Bob, seeing only the surface, had mistaken that for lack of effort. It was a mistake Bob Hope regretted for the rest of his life, and a lesson he never forgot. You're just a drunk with a microphone. The words had been meant to diminish, to reduce Dean Martin's entire career to a cheap gimmick. But Dean's response had reframed everything, had shown Bob that the real gimmick wasn't playing a drunk, it was working so hard to be funny that you forgot to be human. And in that moment, in a cramped green room at NBC Studios in 1967, Bob Hope learned something he should have known all along. That Dean Martin wasn't just a drunk with a microphone. He was an artist who'd mastered the hardest trick of all, making art look like it wasn't work. And that was something worth respecting, worth admiring, worth apologizing for having failed to see. Bob Hope did apologize, years later, in a quiet moment at a party, and Dean Martin accepted that apology with the same grace he brought to everything else in his life, because that's who Dean was. Not just a drunk with a microphone, but a man who understood that everyone deserves a second chance, even Bob Hope.